The house was quiet, with the faint glow of streetlights outside casting gentle shadows across the room. She walked softly down the hallway, her heart racing faster with each step toward the guest room. It was late. Far too late for anyone to be awake, but she couldn't sleep, not tonight, not with him here. Her son-in-law. The thought sent a thrill through her, a wave of heat rising at the forbidden nature of her actions. She knew this was something she shouldn't be doing, that she should turn back, return to her bed, and forget these thoughts. But she couldn't stop herself, she had to see him. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob, her breath catching in her chest. He was likely asleep, worn out from the long drive to visit her. Logic screamed at her to walk away, to retreat to her own room, but she ignored it, slowly turning the knob and pushing the door open just a sliver. He lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Moonlight spilled softly across his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the messy strands of his dark hair. He looked peaceful, almost vulnerable, and something inside her tightened painfully at the sight. She knew she shouldn't be there, but she was. Taking a deep breath, she slipped inside, closing the door gently behind her. The floor creaked slightly under her steps, but he didn't stir. Slowly, with careful steps, she moved closer until she was standing beside the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes roamed over him, taking in the broad shoulders, the strong arms, and the way his shirt had ridden up just enough to reveal a sliver of toned, tanned skin. She bit her lip, her pulse racing as a wild, reckless urge surged through her. Without thinking, she reached out, letting her fingers lightly brush against his arm. He shifted slightly, his brow furrowing, but he didn't wake. Emboldened, she let her fingers drift lower, gliding over the curve of his bicep, feeling the firm muscle beneath his skin. He was stunning, and completely, undeniably out of reach. Her hand trembled as she let it trail down, brushing lightly against his chest. His skin was warm to the touch, his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. She felt a tightening in her chest, a longing she had tried desperately to ignore but couldn't any longer. Biting her lip, she leaned down, her hair falling around them like a curtain, and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. He mumbled something in his sleep, his brow creasing, and she froze, her breath catching. But he didn't wake, not yet. Heart racing, she let her lips wander lower, brushing softly against his cheek, then down to the corner of his mouth. A shaky breath escaped her as she hesitated, her gaze lingering on his face. This was wrong, so incredibly wrong, but she craved it. Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned in and pressed her lips softly against his. It was a light, fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a wave of heat coursing through her, her pulse roaring in her ears. He stirred again, letting out a low, sleepy murmur as his eyes fluttered open, hazy and confused. For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression shifting between shock and something deeper, darker. "Mother-in-law," he rasped, his voice rough with sleep, low and husky, sending a shiver down her spine. His gaze searched hers, a blend of confusion and disbelief. "What are you doing?" I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. Yet she didn't pull back, couldn't. I couldn't sleep." "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his brow creasing slightly, but he didn't move, his hands resting by his sides, his eyes locked on hers. "I know," she breathed, her fingers shaking as they brushed lightly against his chest. "But I can't help it." For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved, the air between them heavy with an electric charge, thick with the weight of what was unsaid. Then, slowly, his hand lifted, his fingers gently brushing against her cheek. "What are you doing?" he asked again, his voice softer, his gaze probing hers. "I don't know," she whispered, leaning into his touch, her heart pounding wildly, her pulse so strong it felt like it might burst through her chest. "But I want you." He drew in a sharp breath, his gaze darkening, and for a moment she thought he might push her away. But instead, with a low, frustrated growl, he pulled her down to him, his mouth crashing into hers in a kiss that stole the air from her lungs. It was wild, desperate, a collision of lips and teeth and tongues that left her breathless, her hands tangling in his hair. He rolled them over, pinning her beneath him, his body pressing down on hers, hot, hard, unyielding. "You shouldn't be doing this," he murmured against her lips, his breath hot and ragged. "We shouldn't be doing this." "Please," she whimpered, arching up into him, her fingers clutching at his shirt. Please, I need you. He groaned softly, his lips trailing down the side of her neck, nipping lightly at her skin. His hands slid beneath her shirt, his touch scorching, and she gasped, her back arching as he explored her with a hunger that matched her own. Tell me you want this, he demanded, his voice low and rough. Tell me you want me. I want you, she breathed, her fingers tightening in his hair. I want you so much. With a deep, guttural sound, he claimed her mouth in another fierce kiss, his hands sliding down to grip her hips, pulling her closer. His touch was everywhere, teasing, tormenting, driving her to the edge. She moaned softly, her hips moving against him, her body aching for more. You're going to be the death of me, he growled into her ear, his voice rough, his lips brushing against her skin. You know that. I don't care, she whispered, her fingers trailing down his back, tracing the hard lines of his muscles. I just want you. For a long, breathless moment, they simply stared at one another, the world around them fading into nothingness. Slowly, his hands drifted down, tugging at the hem of her shirt, pulling it over her head and tossing it aside. God, he breathed, his gaze intense and filled with desire as he took in the sight of her. You're beautiful, a flush of heat colored her cheeks, and she bit her lip, her heartbeat quickening. I'm perfect, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his hands moving up to cradle her face, his lips brushing softly against hers. You're perfect, he repeated, his voice fierce. Then he kissed her again, his mouth hot and demanding, his hands exploring every part of her, learning what made her gasp, what made her moan. She melted into his touch, her body shivering, her mind overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. I need you, she whimpered, her nails pressing lightly into his shoulders. Please, I need you, I know, he replied, his breath warm against her skin. His hands slid lower, skimming over her stomach, his fingers lightly brushing against her thigh. And I'm going to give you exactly what you need, baby. Just be patient, and he did. He held her close, his body hovering above hers, as if savoring each trembling breath she drew. Her hands clung to his shoulders, her nails digging in as he teased her with soft, barely there touches making her squirm beneath him. I've wanted this for so long, he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. Wanted to feel you like this, to taste you. His words sent a shiver down her spine, heat flooding through her. She gasped softly, her eyes closing as he leaned down, pressing slow, open-mouthed kisses along the curve of her neck. His mouth was warm against her skin, his tongue flicking out to taste her, and she whimpered, her body arching toward him instinctively. Please, she whispered, her voice breathless and desperate. Please, don't stop. A low chuckle rumbled from him, the sound vibrating against her skin. Oh, I'm not going to stop, he promised, his hands sliding down to grip her hips, pinning her in place. Not until you're begging for me. His words sent a rush of heat straight to her core, and she moaned softly, her fingers tightening in his hair. He moved lower, his lips trailing down her collarbone, his hands slipping beneath the waistband of her pajama pants. Her breath caught, her heart pounding wildly as he pushed them down, his fingers grazing the bare skin of her thighs. You're so soft, he murmured, his voice thick with desire. So perfect, she whimpered, her body trembling as he kissed her stomach, his hands parting her thighs gently. She gasped, her eyes snapping open as his mouth moved lower, hot and insistent against her skin. Don't tease me, she pleaded, her voice shaking. Please, Shesh, he soothed, his lips brushing lightly against the sensitive skin of her inner thigh. I know, sweetheart. Just let me take care of you. And then he was kissing her again, his mouth hot and relentless, his tongue teasing her with skillful strokes. She cried out softly, her back arching, her fingers twisting in the sheets as he explored her with a slow, deliberate intensity that left her breathless. Oh God, she whimpered, her body writhing beneath him. Please, please, I need more, he growled softly, his hands tightening on her thighs, and then he shifted, moving up to cover her with his body. He captured her mouth in a searing kiss, his hands cupping her face as he kissed her deeply, fiercely, as if he couldn't get enough. You're going to drive me insane, he muttered against her lips, his voice raw and strained. Do you know that? Sss. I want to, she whispered, her hands sliding down his back, her nails scraping lightly against his skin. I want you to lose control. Please, he sucked in a sharp breath at her words, his gaze darkening. For a moment he just stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then with a low, frustrated growl he buried his face in her neck, his hands tangling in her hair. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured roughly, his lips brushing against her ear. "No idea how much I want you." "Then take me," she whispered, arching up against him. "Please, I need you," he swore softly, pressing his mouth to hers, his kiss urgent and demanding, his hands sliding down to grip her hips. He adjusted their position, pressing closer, and she gasped, her body trembling as he settled between her legs, his weight grounding her against the mattress. "Tell me you want this," he demanded, his voice rough and husky. "Tell me you want me." "I want you," she breathed, her fingers digging into his back. "I want you so much," a low growl rumbled in his chest, and then he kissed her again, his hands moving up to cradle her face, his fingers weaving through her hair. His mouth claimed hers with a fervent hunger, and she melted beneath him, her body shaking, her mind spinning from the intensity of it all. His hands traveled lower, tracing the curves of her body, and she let out a soft whimper, her back arching as his fingers brushed over her skin. He took his time, exploring her slowly, methodically, discovering what made her gasp, what drew out her moans. She writhed beneath him, her body aching for more, for everything he could give. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please, I need you." "Not yet," he replied gently, his lips trailing down her neck, his hands sliding lower to grip her hips. "Not until you're begging for me," she bit back a moan of frustration, her fingers twisting in his hair as he kissed his way down her body. His touch was everywhere, teasing, tormenting, driving her to the brink. She gasped, her body arching up toward him, her breaths coming in short, desperate pants. "Please," she begged again, her voice shaking. "Please, I'm begging you." He let out a low growl, his hands tightening on her hips. Then he moved, his mouth hot and insistent against her skin. She cried out softly, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body trembling with each kiss, every touch, each breath he took. And finally, he gave her exactly what she needed, their bodies moving together in a wild, frantic dance of need and longing. They tangled in each other, their breaths mingling, lost in the heat, the passion, the intensity of the moment. Hours slipped away in a blur of kisses, caresses, and whispered confessions. And when the first light of dawn crept through the window, they remained wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies intertwined, their hearts pounding. It was wrong, it was forbidden. But as they clung to one another, it felt like the most natural thing in the world.